I see the expense ratios of the funds in my Vanguard 401k, but X% of what? I don't see any fees in my quarterly statement, so I called and asked how much I paid in fees, and they said, well, that is impossible to know. Could you clarify when the fees are paid?
Well, hello, Josh, and that's a great question. The expense ratio is the percentage of assets the fund company is going to keep to run the fund. They use it to pay the manager, operation, marketing, annual reports, and stuff like that. It is a percentage of your investment. However, if you invest $10,000 into a fund that has an expense ratio of maybe 1%, for example, that doesn't mean you're going to pay a flat $100 for the upcoming year. You actually don't know how much you're going to pay because the fund is going to go up and down in value. To get a little insight into the logistics of actually how this works, I actually got some insight from the very sharp Greg Haygood of Motley Fool Funds. Essentially, I'm going to give you a simplified version. Essentially, every day, a proportion of the fund's estimated annual expenses are taken out of the assets every day. So think of it as like the fund company estimates we need this much to cover our expenses. We're going to take 1/365th of that out of the assets of the fund every day. And then they calculate the NAV of the fund, which is the net asset value. That's kind of the share price of a fund. You only get that once a day after the market is closed. And one of the reasons why you can only get that value once a day is because the fund has to do sort of all these shenanigans in terms of accounting for expenses and the dividends that come in and the changes in the values of the investments.
But not bad shenanigans.
No, good shenanigans. Good nanigans. Something like that. Anyways, but so you don't really know how much you're going to pay or how much you did pay. But that's how it works. Since you brought up your 401k, Josh, it is also important to know that you could look at Vanguard's website, for example, and see an expense ratio on their fund of 0.2%. But then look in your 401k and see expense ratio of 0.5%. It's higher. That's because the expenses to run the 401k might be folded into the 401k. So you can't necessarily rely on what's on like Morningstar or a fund's company site. You have to see what you're actually paying in your 401k.
So there's the 401k fee, and then there's also the mutual fund fee.
Right,
so
exactly.
So that's why it's more.
And there are some expenses that actually aren't in the expense ratio, like if you pay an advisor a commission to buy the fund, and the commissions that the fund company uses to buy and sell the investments. Those aren't in the expense ratio. You have to go to some crazy document to figure out how much the fund company paid in commissions. Like for the Vanguard 500 in 2014, they paid something like $800,000 in trading commissions, which sounds like a lot of money, but for a fund that's worth $160 billion, as it was at the end of 2014, it's kind of negligible. But for smaller funds that are active traders, those commissions can get high, and those are not incorporated into the expense ratio. So you're actually paying more than you really thought you were.
So when he called Vanguard and they said, well, that's impossible to know, they were kind of right?
They were kind of right because they don't keep a tally of like that 1/365th of expenses that he was particularly, that could be attributed to his investment. You don't really know. It is kind of odd when you think about it. Like you're paying for a product and you don't know how much you are going to pay.
That's the way it works.
That's the way it works.